Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your patience with our letting folks in little by little. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for our second and final session of If Roe Falls, How Should Progressive Catholics Respond? And with Archbishop Cordileone's banning Speaker Nancy Pelosi from communion due to her support for allowing pregnant people to access abortion, this question becomes even more urgent than it was just a week ago when we started this series. So we have some amazing people with us tonight to help address this question. Before we go any further, I just want to remind everyone that we will be recording these sessions and making them available for future viewing and use. My name is Marianne Duddyberg, and I serve as the Executive Director of Dignity USA. And along with Russ Petrus of Future Church in the center square up there, I'm a co-chair of Catholic Organizations for Renewal, which is sponsoring this session and the one we had last week. Catholic Organizations for Renewal, also known as CORE, is a leadership forum of U.S. Catholic reform organizations. The purpose is to further reform and renewal in the Roman Catholic Church, to build an inclusive church, to bring about a world of justice and peace, and to reflect the sacredness of all creation. If you're interested in knowing more about CORE, you can find out more on our website, and I will put the link for that in the chat. Tonight's session is packed with critically important information on the white supremacist roots of the war over abortion, an introduction to the reproductive justice frame for this debate, a groundbreaking study on the impact of access to abortion or lack thereof on a pregnant person's whole life, and the personal journey of one doctor who provides abortion. To moderate our conversation and to introduce these amazing panelists, I am very pleased to introduce Jamie Manson, the president of Catholics for Choice. Jamie?
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you everyone for being here. Before we start, I just want to name that I know the last 24 hours have been hard with what's happened in Texas. And many of us are feeling very raw about that, and just want to acknowledge that. And I want to thank you for finding the energy to join us for this urgent topic. Just wanted to name that we're just holding everyone in our hearts very deeply, we're holding a lot right now. We're really holding a lot, and so I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists for being here. This is truly the dream team that you want speaking to you about abortion justice, and I'm so thrilled every one of these panelists was here to help and to speak to us. Marianne is right, it is a packed panel. We're going to be giving a lot of information. We will be recording it and sharing this with you so you can, watch it again and unpack it, share it with friends. We also have 2 other videos that I did for a small group of core leaders that also talk about some of these topics in depth that we will also be sharing with you, the links to that as well in our follow-up. I will be introducing each panelist as they present. I'll be asking them each a different question, and they'll present for about 10 minutes. And after that, we'll do a few more extra questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. And so please put your questions in the chat at that point. So let's begin. We're going to begin with the wonderful Dr. Kenyetta Chinwe. Kenyetta Chinwe and I became friends and housemates 2 weeks ago at a convening that we were at together. And I'm just so thrilled that She's here with us. Kenyetta is the Sister Song Faith Advocacy Coordinator, where she's working to build a base of faith leaders and people of faith who support reproductive health, rights, and access. Through her work in faith-based leadership, she has been ordained as a minister in the Madonna Ministries and has the titles of Priestess and High Priestess conferred on her. What an honor to have you with us, Kenyetta. So my question for you is that many of us, when we speak about abortion rights, think of it in a choice framework. But back in 1994, 12 Black women developed a new framework for thinking about abortion access that they called reproductive justice. Can you explain the history of reproductive justice and its central tenets and why it's different from reproductive rights?
Absolutely. First of all, I appreciate that introduction. I am not doctor yet, but I am Reverend. It is my pleasure to be here. Before I start, though, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I sit, as many of us are settlers, immigrants, and descendants of those who were forcefully brought to this land. It is our collective responsibility to pay respect and recognize that this land where I sit is the traditional land of the Muscogee and Creek Aboriginal people. And we are here because this land was occupied, in recognition that it is that this space is occupied, colonized Aboriginal territory. And out of the respect of the rights of the Aboriginal people, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the colonial history and present day implications of this, and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. The land recognition statement that I used was developed by Dr. Elizabeth Packett of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and it is the one that I use almost always when I'm presenting. Reproductive justice. Well, in 1994, as Jamie mentioned, 12 Black women that we refer to in the reproductive justice movement as the founding mothers created, conceived, and birthed a intersectional movement framework known as reproductive justice. A short answer is that it is the place where reproductive rights and social justice meet. These 12 Black women realized that the choice movement of the time did not address all of the issues that impact the reproductive lives of Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, and poor women. And so they sought to create a framework that would actually address not just abortion rights, but issues of access, as well as environmental, social, and economic issues that impact our reproductive lives. And so they came up with the phrase reproductive justice. It sits on 4 basic tenets that are rooted in the human rights framework, as well as Black feminist theory. Those 4 tenets are that we believe that everyone has the human right to have a child, to not have a child, to parent the children that they have in safe, sustainable communities, free from interpersonal and state-sanctioned violence, and to have bodily autonomy. I'll take a moment to note that what happened yesterday is in the framework of reproductive justice is a reproductive justice issue. We have the right to raise our children without the constant fear of violence. And so those 4 tenets, like I said, are the basis upon which a reproductive justice sits. What makes it different from the binary framework of pro-life and pro-choice is that it addresses a myriad of social and economic issues and broadens the space for where people can enter into this fight for reproductive rights. And so, like, in the context of my work, I work with faith communities. I'm here in Georgia, and a lot of times the way that I am able to usher congregations into entering this work is by meeting them where they are within the context of this reproductive justice framework. And to give you an example, here in Georgia, we are battling a ridiculous maternal mortality rate, not only in the context of the country, but the world. We have one of the worst maternal mortality rates in Georgia, in the developed world. And a lot of congregations of many faith expressions, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, are actually becoming very, very interested in what they can do around this issue. And this issue allows me to start conversations with clergy about reproductive rights, because I am able to address their concerns about maternal mortality, but then also I'm able to lead them back to the understanding that restrictive reproductive laws actually affect this issue that they are already very, very concerned with. The amazing thing about reproductive justice as a framework is that it seeks to be as inclusive as it can be of all bodies. The last tenet, bodily autonomy, was actually added in 2010 in an effort to make sure that the framework included our LGBTQIA+ family. And it actually, by adding that tenet, gave us such a broad base to be able to even explain what we were talking about in terms of reproductive rights, because the bottom line is that the sovereignty to choose and make decisions about your health is a matter of bodily autonomy. And it's not just about rights. It's not just about access. It's saying that you, as a human being and as an individual, get to make decisions about your lives without government intervention. But yeah, those are the basics of reproductive justice. It centers those who are most impacted, specifically Black, Indigenous, poor, and women of color. But we in the reproductive justice movement understand that everybody has an RJ story. And if we can all tap into that understanding, it actually will expand the way that we can fight for our rights.
Thank you so much, Kenyetta, and we'll be following up with you with questions. And I'm very honored to have conferred your honorary doctorate onto you. And thank you so much. Thank you. Katherine Stewart is with us. And Katherine wrote one of my favorite books of the last 2 years. Katherine is a journalist and author who covers politics, policy, and religious freedom. Her work has appeared in publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Republic. Her latest book, the one I love, is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And the book looks at the movement that brought Donald Trump to power. Pains me to even say his name. Katherine, question for you. The modern anti-choice movement has deep roots in white supremacy and anti-feminism. Can you speak to how evangelicals pivoted to abortion as the issue they chose to animate their base, and how today the abortion issue is intertwined with the rise of white nationalism and Christian supremacy?
Thanks so much, Jamie. That's a really great question. I want to thank you and Catholics for Choice and my fellow panelists. And thanks to all of you tuning in for this conversation. Christian nationalists have sold us this idea that their movement was a grassroots reaction to abortion, but the movement in its contemporary form sort of, it had its seeds in an earlier era, but it really arose in its current, in the form that it's currently become in the late 1970s with a new political movement, a reactionary political movement calling itself the New Right. This New Right included people like Paul Weyrich, Howard Phillips, Phyllis Schlafly, and a number of others. And they were, deeply upset about the direction of the Republican Party itself, which they felt had become too liberal, too soft on communism. They were extremely upset about the civil rights movement. They were really sort of panicked about racial equality and the prospect of racial equality and women's equality. They were upset about the women's rights movement as well. They were also concerned about the liberalism of a lot of prominent religious leaders at the time, like Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, and they joined together with some hyper-conservative Catholic leaders like George Weigel, Richard John Newhouse, who shared their concerns, particularly with respect to forms of religion that emphasize the social gospel, but they were all upset about these other issues. So they had a panoply of issues that upset them. they really wanted to ignite the hyper-conservative counter-revolution and drag the Republican Party and society overall to the right. The thing that really got them up in the morning, the key issue that sort of animated their paranoia was the civil rights movement and the fear that racially segregated schools might be deprived of their lucrative tax exemptions. They had drawn in some what they called electronic ministers, people like Jerry Falwell and Robeson and others into their network. And Falwell, many of his fellow Southern white conservative pastors were involved with these segregated schools, these racially segregated schools in university. Bob Jones Sr. went so far as to call segregation God's established order. And he referred to desegregationists as satanic propagandists who are, quote, leading colored Christians astray. And this is what he said, and as far as these pastors were concerned, they had the right not just to segregate people and establish hierarchies of race rooted in their religion, but also to receive federal money, taxpayer money for the purpose. So they sort of coalesced around this fear that the Supreme Court was going to end their tax exemptions for their schools. But they needed to sort of draw in like others to this movement, sort of persuade everybody that this is or the Republican Party, this is a good idea. So they knew that sort of stop the tax on segregation was like not going to be an effective rallying cry. It's such an ugly, represents, it sort of reveals too much of the ugliness of the core, at the core of their concerns. So they basically, went down a laundry list of issues that they thought they might be able to use to unite their movement. And I'm talking 1979 or so. This is the late 1970s, after Roe versus Wade was passed. 6 years at least. So number one was, of course, the threat of tax privileges for racist academies. They thought about school prayer, but that tended to alienate the Catholics for a number of very solid historical reasons that I won't go into here. They thought about a number of other issues like the women's movement. They thought about, should we talk about the ERA, but it was going down in flames anyway. But when they got to abortion, it was like a light bulb went off and they thought, wow, that could really work. So this part of the history has really been erased by the movement leadership today, Christian nationalist movement leadership, and many conservative-leaning American voters have been persuaded over time that abortion is the single most important issue when it comes to their vote. But I just want to go briefly into, let's look at the overtime piece of it. When Roe versus Wade was passed, most Protestant Republicans supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention hailed the decision in an editorial in their wire service and passed resolutions sort of hailing the liberalization of abortion laws in 1971 and 74. Ronald Reagan passed the most liberal abortion law in the country in 1967. Barry Goldwater supported abortion law liberalization too, at least early in his career. And his wife, Peggy Goldwater, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. I mean, these were like conservative, gold in the conservative movement, but yeah, she co-founded Planned Parenthood. But over time, those pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. Phyllis Schlafly actually wrote a really interesting book about that called How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. And what it shows that it wasn't easy at all to get everyone on board, but today we're kind of seeing a pro-life religion among the sort of far right. It unites, it cuts across denominational boundaries and seems to unite between the us versus the them, the pure versus the impure. But this was really a modern creation and it was created for political purposes.
Thank you, Katherine. It's tough to get that whole history in 5 to 10 minutes. That was really impressive. I will follow up with you with another question after we go through the panel. Thank you so much. And I just muted myself for reasons that defy explanation. I'm also very honored to introduce you to Dr. Greene Foster, who also wrote one of my favorite books of the last few years. Diana was the leader of the Turnaway Study and author of the accompanying book, The Turnaway Study, 10 Years, 1,000 Women, and the Consequences of Having or Being Denied an Abortion. She received her MA and PhD in demography and public policy from Princeton University. She is the director of research at the University of California, San Francisco, Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health program, or ANSWER, where her work focuses on the effectiveness of family planning policies and the effects of unintended pregnancy. And it is such a delight and an honor to have you here, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so hard to do my talk when all I want to do is add points to everyone else's talk or say how interesting. But and now you're going to think I did my whole talk to respond to Reverend Chinwe's comment that people can make decisions for their own lives better than the government can do it for them, because it turns out this is a key finding of the study I led. Yeah. So I led the Turnaway Study, which is a study of people from across the country, some of whom were just a little bit too late to get an abortion and from the facility near them, and some of them were just under the limit of those facilities and received their abortion. So we followed both groups over 3 years of recruiting and 5 years of following them. A huge group of women scientists followed these people and did interviews every 6 months for 5 years. And what we find is that when you ask people about their decision-making around pregnancy, they have a lot of reasons for wanting to have an abortion. These are careful decisions. They've considered their own responsibilities to their families, to their own aspirations, and their goals for the future. The wanting to have a child later, maybe under more stable conditions with a better partner, when they're in physical health to sustain a pregnancy. So people have a lot of reasons. The leading one is that they feel that they can't afford to have a child, but that's rarely the only reason people give. And when we follow people over time, we see that the experiences of people who are denied abortions, they are living out the fears of the people in this study. That when people are making this decision, they understand the consequences for their lives. We see that people report that they don't have enough money to support a child. We see that those who are denied are more likely to become poor. They say they want to take care of their existing children, and we see that their existing children actually do worse in terms of achievement of developmental milestones and the chance that the child is living in a house with enough money to pay for basic living needs. They say that the man involved in the pregnancy, it's not a good enough relationship. And we see that those relationships dissolve regardless of whether the woman received an abortion or was denied. And so this study shows that this decision there isn't a big change in trajectory for people who receive their abortions. They go on, stay in school, continue working, mostly break up with the man involved, but they're kind of continuing the path they were on. And the big divergence is the people who are denied, and in measurable ways in terms of immediate mental health and long-term physical health, their lives are worse. And in fact, 2 women died of childbirth-related causes in this study. So in this country, we have a lot of crises, and one of them is a maternal mortality crisis. And this study shows how physically risky childbirth is. And it's one thing that we take for granted, people making this sacrifice. I don't think we should take them for granted, but we do take them for granted when they're trying to make a child because they want to have a child. But the fact is, when people are denied access to legal abortion, many will carry the pregnancy to term, and they will experience serious physical health consequences, and those consequences will last for years. So this is, unfortunately, when we started this study, we did not foresee that the really relevant group here was going to be the people who are denied abortions. This seems to me to tell us the future for when Roe is overturned. There are many people who won't be able to travel across state lines to get an abortion elsewhere. those people are going to experience the experiences of the women in the Turnaway Study in terms of increased poverty, worse physical health, lowered ability to achieve their own aspirational plans, including having a wanted child later, and lower ability to achieve other aspirational life plans.
Thank you so much, Diana. I just put a link in the chat to a bunch of things, Kenyetta's organization, Katherine's book, and also your book, Diana, plus an interview you did on Fresh Air, I think 2 years ago now, that absolutely changed my life. And so I really want to encourage you. Yeah, it's an amazing interview. And so I want to encourage everybody.
Yeah, really tempting to tell about my Christian grandmother who was pressured by her extremely religious parents to have an abortion. So I can living proof of the switch that conservative Christians have made against abortion.
Thank you, Diana. I want to move to Dr. Jennifer Villavicencio. Jen, hello, thank you for being here. Jen graduated from residency at Brown University, completed a complex family planning fellowship at the University of Michigan, and also has a master's in public policy from the Gerald R. Ford School at the University of Michigan. Jen is an expert in OBGYN and complex family planning, health policy, and strategic communication of socially complex subjects. And bless her, she is a board member of Catholics for Choice. I don't know what we'd do without her. So Jen, thank you so much for being here. You have an amazing story. We did a Facebook Live about it that you can find on Catholics for Choice's Facebook page, telling your story about how when you were younger, you were an abortion opponent. And now you are a doctor who provides abortion care. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your journey and even how your faith still relates to your provision of abortion care.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you for having me on this panel. And before I get into my own story, I first want to reiterate how humbled I am to be on this panel. All of you, all three of you, are giants in this field, and the RJ movement and has changed the way that I and so many of my colleagues practice medicine. Dr. Greene Foster, we cite the Turnaway Study literally like every day, and it's such a groundbreaking study. And so I just want to reiterate for the folks who are watching this that this is really quite an amazing group of people that we're getting to listen to. And I actually came right to this panel from clinic. I was providing abortion care today, and I wanted to share a story that I think illustrates a lot of what we've heard. I was taking care of a young Black woman who came in with her partner and also had her sister on the phone, illustrating how these are often family decisions that are made. They're made within the context of the community in which people live. And she was really nervous, and her partner was really engaged and asking questions. And we were, kind of joking around a little bit. She was young. And she at one point was asking me about future pregnancies and whether or not she would be able to have kids, because that's a myth that people that get really worried about. And I said, this will not impact your ability to have kids in the future. And she goes, oh, good, thank goodness, because, I really, really want to be a mom. And part of the reason why I'm having an abortion now is so that I can set myself up to be able to be a good mom in the future. And then she said, do you deliver babies? Because I'd love for you to deliver my baby in the future. And it was such an incredible experience. Her sister was asking me about her recovery, and her partner was asking questions. And it was just such an incredible experience to watch this support structure think about her future and her lived experience and her expertise in her own life. And having abortion was not only affirming of her life as it is now, but also her intentions of motherhood and parenthood in the future, and in building a family in the future. And that so beautifully illustrates the tenets of reproductive justice and why they're so important, why we have to look at not only abortion, but also family building and supporting families. And also, again, is an anecdotal illustration of the results that Diana's study showed, that people are making these decisions extraordinarily thoughtfully and carefully. And it's these experiences that helped shape and change the way that I view abortion. So I'm a first generation Latina, and I grew up in Miami, and I was a devout Catholic for my whole life. It was a huge part of growing up. I went to Catholic school starting at 6th grade. I wanted to be a nun. I was in the youth group. I mean, I was very into it. It's part of my personality to be a student in everything that I do. And I wanted to be an A+ Catholic. And it was deeply devoted to youth group. And we did a lot within the, what at the time we called the pro-life movement. Now I talk about as the anti-choice movement. We worked with crisis pregnancy centers, and we, did protests on US 1 during 40 Days of Life. And we were taught that this was something that was good. And, to oppose abortion was something good for women and children. We were protecting women and babies. And I tell this story in this way because I think it's important that first to acknowledge that for some people, these deeply held values of being pro-life or anti-abortion are not based, at least overtly, in misogyny, but they're based in either their religion, their faith, and a misunderstanding of how to actualize a lot of their values. One of my most continued deeply held values that I was taught through my Catholic faith was that of justice. And I really felt like I was actualizing justice by being pro-life and engaging in this activism. I was a pretty intense activist well into my early 20s, right about until the time I went to med school. There was a lot of things happening at that point in my life. I actually had a fiance that I was engaged to. It's not unusual when you're, a pretty devout, in a devout Christian faith tradition, that you get engaged early. And we were going to separate colleges. We both were really ambitious, and we decided that we wanted to have sex before we were married. But we wanted to do it in the context of some sort of permission. And so I actually asked my dad if it was okay if I had sex for the first time when I was 19. And after an awkward pause, he actually said, I think that makes sense. You're responsible. You've been with him. We know him. I think that makes sense. Unfortunately, after the first time that I had sex, I ended up needing Plan B, or the morning after pill. And this was before it was over the counter. And so I actually was in Florida, had to go to a family planning clinic that provided abortions to get the morning after pill. And there were protesters outside, and they were screaming horrible things. I mean, truly like vitriolic things at me and my fiance who was with me. And I remember thinking as I was walking through this crowd that, I'm on your side. I believe what you do. He's my fiance. My dad said it was okay. Like, I'm just here for the morning after pill. I was doing so many of these excuses, continuing to try to other people. Until I got into the clinic and I sat down and I realized that I couldn't tell the difference between me or anybody else who was there. I couldn't other people the way that I had been taught to for so long, and that I was so comfortable. And I wish that was my lightning bolt moment, but it wasn't. I was 19 and still sort of coming into my own. I left the church for a lot of different reasons, and really unrelated to abortion, actually. And I went to medical school, and I became much more interested in science and sort of understanding. I met my first atheist, and they didn't have horns. And so I was like, okay, maybe there's something that I can explore here. And so I learned more about embryology and pregnancy and all of those things. And I kind of left the movement, the pro-life movement, the anti-choice movement, and was focusing on medical school, which is, a full-time job and a half. And then I decided actually to go into OBGYN. I thought I was going to be a cancer surgeon, until one night, my second year of residency, when I was taking care of a patient on labor and delivery who was having an abortion, an induction abortion, which is when you take medications to deliver, but it's to terminate the pregnancy. She had lethal fetal anomalies. There were problems with the pregnancy that would mean that the baby would not survive. And I call it a baby because that's what my patient called it. And I was told by my attending, my boss, the person who was supervising me, that she wasn't interested. She doesn't do abortions, doesn't believe in them. And so she's not going to help me. Don't call her. And so it was all by myself. And so was the patient, left with me, a second year resident. Fortunately, she delivered without any issues, and she asked to hold her baby. And I was really nervous because the fetus really looked anomalous. There was a lot of things wrong with it. It wasn't what you would expect a fetus to look like. But I wrapped it up as best as I could, and I handed it to her. And she's 21. It's the middle of the night, and she looks down and she says, "Look at how beautiful my daughter is." And I get chills every time I tell this story, and I tell this story a lot because this was my lightning bolt moment. It was the moment that I realized that there's so much complexity involved in reproduction and abortion and love and parenthood and motherhood. And this 21-year-old woman knew more about that than I could ever hope to. And she had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to take care of her. And it was in that moment that I realized that I could better operationalize that value that I so deeply held, justice, so much better by taking people who needed my care, whether they come to me because they want to have a healthy pregnancy and have me deliver their baby, or because they need an abortion. I wanted to be that person that was there, receiving them with compassion and without judgment. And I have continued to grow in change over the course of time. And I've really learned a lot from about how the intersectionality and how all of the things that we were talking about earlier intersect with abortion and reproduction, and how environmental justice, criminal justice, all of those things are reproductive justice, and they all impact my patients' lives. And so I am really passionate about communicating about abortion because I am living proof that people can change their minds, that people can have their hearts shifted in a way. If you had asked me when I was 21 if I was going to be an abortion provider, I would have truly laughed. That was an impossibility. I have stories, and happy to talk about with anybody, with my mom, and how we talked about me providing abortion with my mom, who is a devout Catholic, and to this day thinks that abortion is a sin. But we were able to get to a point where she is standing next to me and supporting me in the work that I'm doing, because she knows me and knows my heart and knows that I'm doing what I think is right, even if that maybe doesn't align totally with her values. And that's the kind of person that my mother is. Really a beautiful soul that we don't necessarily, she wants to be out rah-rah protesting now. We live in DC, and she's like mad at me that we haven't gone out to protest yet. But we need people to be able to move around in this nuance and this complexity in these gray areas and say, okay, maybe I personally feel like this is a challenging subject for me or for my family, but not vote on that, not go to the voting booth and use and act on that conflict. And so I'm really humbled and honored to be able to provide this care every single day. It is truly my calling, and I hope to do it until the last breath that I take, because I really believe that I'm helping people every single day and making sure that I'm operationalizing that value of justice that is so core to me and was instilled in me by my faith.
And thank you so much. You've told that story in other venues for Catholics for Choice, and it still gives me chills too. I wonder if it's okay with you if I follow up. I'm going to follow up with each of our panelists with a follow-up question, but I thought I would start with you. In what you read in the media and what you hear, the way you hear people talk about abortion, what do you think people most misunderstand about abortion care that you would love to tell them?
Everything. Truly. So we've done studies and looked at what the general public thinks about abortion care, and they truly misunderstand who provides abortion care. They think that still have this idea that people who provide abortion care are unskilled doctors. They can't imagine why they would provide abortion care. And so they think that they are only doing it because they can't get another job, or because they want to make a lot of money. They're greedy or they're unethical. And those are hard things to hear, but that's how people think about it. And so one of the myths that I would like to bust is that I have never known a group of people who are more committed, more talented, and have more grit and honor than people who provide abortion care. We go above and beyond every single day. We put our safety, our family safety at risk in order to show up for the people in our communities who need it. Most of us are incredibly intelligent, highly skilled, could do anything, and we've chosen to do this. And we do it out of conscience, and because we believe that it's what we are called to do in order to serve our patients. One of the other things I think that is really misunderstood is that abortion is not safe. Abortion is incredibly safe. It is one of the safest outpatient procedures that you can have. Medication abortion has a lower complication rate than ibuprofen or Tylenol generally, if you look at major complication rates. And so it's been stigmatized and polarized so much that people think, well, it has to be unsafe if it's being regulated this much. And that's just truly a falsehood. And the other piece of this is that we've talked a little bit about the types of people who have abortions. And I think that the image that a lot of Americans have in their head is that it is a scared young teenager who's all alone and who is being taken advantage of by these greedy, unscrupulous doctors. And honestly, if there are people out there who believe that, I understand why they would support restrictions, right? If you care about people and you care about women and children, you might come to that conclusion. And so really repairing that flawed mental template and helping people recognize that all types of people need abortions. It's young teens, it's college students. I did an abortion the other day for a grandmother of 4. Moms, lawyers, doctors, dentists, everybody needs abortions. And oftentimes they're making those decisions with their partners or with their families and in the context of their communities. And they also are doing so with their doctors and with their providers. There's myths out there that once you come into the abortion clinic, you can't leave. People change their minds all the time. They come in, they have a conversation, they get options counseling, and they say, you know what, I think I need to take a minute, or this actually isn't the right thing for me. And we hand them paperwork and refer them to prenatal care and want them to have healthy pregnancies. And so I think that the complexities of abortion care are really missed, but I also think the simplicities and the facts of it, which is that it is frankly kind of a mundane thing in a day-to-day practice. It is safe most of the time, completely uncomplicated, and 1 in 4 women will have an abortion by the time that they're 45. So it's extraordinarily common as well. And it is politicians, as Katherine was talking about, it's politicians and people who are looking to gain that have politicized this, that have polarized it and made it into this really black and white issue. For most people, it's a gray issue. It's complicated. I didn't think I'd need an abortion, but now I do, and here I am. And helping people manage that conflict, I think, is really necessary and critical in trying to move the needle and change hearts and minds.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you. Kenyetta, I'd love to follow up with you next. There was an amazing article in the AP this weekend about Black women's faith, Black women who are providing abortion care and their faith. And it said, religious backers of abortion rights say God is on their side. And it was a very powerful article where you saw abortion care nurses are reading scripture between meetings and, and between patients and things like this. And I wonder if you could speak to that. There's a number of conservative Catholic publications that often make the argument that abortion care is racist because clinics are only in Black neighborhoods. And I wonder if you can speak to that and speak to the relationship of Black women and their faith and abortion care.
Yes. First, before I go, I just want to say to Dr. Jen, I am a Miami native too. And so when you said, I was like, hey, born and raised. So I totally understand what I had all kind of context for what you were talking about. So the reality is that to kind of piggyback off what Katherine said earlier, is that the far-right movement often couches abortion as racist in order to recruit Black people to co-sign their egregious policies that they're trying to implement. But the fact of the matter is that before 1960, 70-ish, you would have been hard pressed to find a Black clergy preaching about abortion. And it wasn't that it was something that they celebrated. It's just that it just wasn't talked about. And Black clergy understood that people did what they needed to do for their lives. For most of the history of at least Christian faith in this country, Black faith has been grounded in the concept of liberation and emancipation. And so most of our theology is built around that thought process. And so this theology that seeks to oppress is not one that is traditionally ours. And so I am not surprised or put off by the fact that many of the people who are performing abortions in Black communities, like the abortion nurses who were featured in that article, are also faithful people. You know, Black people by large are faithful people, and our faith, in my experience, compels us towards justice. I am the daughter of a Pentecostal preacher. I am the granddaughter of a Pentecostal preacher. I am the niece, sibling of long lines of Pentecostal preachers. And the one thing that I got my, before I knew about reproductive justice, before, you know, while I was still growing up, my position on this issue came from my father, the Pentecostal preacher, who often said, he says, I don't believe in abortion. I would never want one of my daughters to have one. But just like we get to decide that as a family, I think everybody else gets to decide that as well. And so that has been the root of my position around abortion for most of my life, because I understood it was about people getting to make decisions for themselves. And I think there are more Black and Brown and Indigenous people who live in that gray area that Dr. Jen was talking about than on either ends of the binary that we've created. To give you another anecdotal example, I spent Mother's Day with one of my sisters and my niece. And you know, Mother's Day was literally just a few days after the leak happened. And my niece had made brunch for us. And we, of course, were sitting and talking about, you know, the events of the world. And my sister, who is 62, who has been a Pentecostal woman her whole life, who is an ordained minister, said to me, she says, you know, I don't believe in abortion. She says, but I also believe that the government doesn't have a right to tell people what they should do with their bodies. And so I feel like, if nothing else, as we try to expand the support in this movement, that we as movement leaders have to make space for the full range of support that shows up. Not everyone who shows up will be pro-abortion, but as long as they understand that people get to make choices for their lives, then we have to make room for them. You know, like Jesus said, if they're not against us, then they're for us. Leave them alone. You know, and so yeah, I think that is probably the root of what was expressed in that article about these women who are faithful women who are doing this abortion work, because they understand that, especially as Black women, that the government controlling our bodies has never been a good thing, ever.
Amen, Kenyetta. Thank you. You said that to me 2 weeks ago, and it is written on my heart now. And I thank you. And I thank you for this audience, particularly of Catholics, you know, who don't necessarily always know where they fall on the issue, to say that it is complex, and that, you know, I can't even say it as well as you said it, but, you know, just naming that complexity that you were talking about for people in the Black church is similar for Catholics. So thank you for naming that. You wanted me to share a link, Just Faith for a Just World. Can you tell me a bit about?
Sure. It's kind of leaning into what I was talking about in terms of creating a narrative where our faith, you know, leads us towards justice. So, you know, the unfortunate root of a lot of the anti-choice movement is people who say their faith compels them to do what they're doing. And so I am trying to create the counter narrative that says that our faith compels us towards justice. So in 2020, I held co-hosted a cross-movement faith organizer event for faith organizers across 7 areas of advocacy: environmental justice, economic justice, labor, immigration, LGBTQIA rights, and voter rights, and criminal justice reform. And in that convening, we came together to uplift each other's work, but also to vision what the best of all possible worlds looks like from each of our lanes of advocacy. If you know, what is a just world where everybody's financial needs are met? What is a just world where borders do not define, you know, how we move? And so at the end of that convening, I took all of our visioning and created this statement. It's a just space for a just world. And the signatures that are collected on it will be organized into what I'm referring to as regional pockets of power. And so that people can find their people, because we are always stronger together than we are apart. And so, and the reproductive justice framework lets me know that fighting for environmental justice is reproductive justice and vice versa. And so if we can actually get people from other movements to understand how their work is integrally connected to the reproductive rights, health, and justice, we become more powerful.
Kenyetta, thank you, because all of those issues you just named are all Catholic issues. Every one of them, workers' rights, the environment, every immigration rights. And so there is an amazing parallel between the reproductive justice framework and the Catholic social justice framework. And that's something we've been trying to work on at Catholics for Choice, is really elucidating that for people to see the amazing mutual strengths that both frameworks have and how they can work together. So thank you. And I think this link you're sharing will really speak to Catholics. These are very social justice-y Catholics on this call, and so it will really speak to them. So thank you. I want to move to Diana. Your work dovetails so beautifully with the reproductive justice framework. And when I listened to you on Fresh Air, you said something that has really, really impacted my thinking deeply. You said, you know, access to abortion is not just about bodily autonomy. It is, of course, but it's about the very trajectory of a woman's life. This choice affects the entire trajectory of her life. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about the moral issues, when you see an article about abortion, it often just has a pregnant woman's torso, or a picture of a fetus. Like, she doesn't even get a head, you know, she's just her abdomen. And what is clear from the data that we have collected is that it isn't even just her head, it's her whole life. That when we look at the experiences of people who receive abortions and those who are denied abortions, it's their children, it's their, just as Dr. Jen was talking about, their ability to take care of future children and to set up their lives in such a way that they have the circumstances where they can support a child later. So the number of people affected, and the you know, in this study, it was, you know, a matter of a day difference and the person is too late to get an abortion. There's a randomness there that really enables us to see what would have been if only, you know, if someone had been a little later or a little earlier. We see this in the trajectories. And what we're about to see with the end of Roe is a whole bunch of people taking a different route than they would have taken. And the consequences will not just be the child born, it will be the woman's life, the pregnant person's life, their existing children, their chance at having subsequent children under better circumstances later, their relationships with the man who got them pregnant and other people as well. Moving forward, we actually see that people who receive their wanted abortions are more likely to report very high quality romantic relationships later. So it's a whole lifetime trajectory of caretaking that is affected.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diane. I'm sure folks will have a lot more questions. I want to end with a follow-up question to Katherine. You know, the whole point of this panel is to talk about social justice issues and how deeply they intersect with abortion care. And something that I think a lot of people don't know is on January 6th, a lot of abortion providers found that the protesters that were outside of their clinics, who usually harass them and threaten them and make all sorts of mischief for them, were not there that day. And in fact, many of them were at the storming the Capitol. And in fact, we know one person from a clinic who helped the FBI identify over 40 men that were storming the Capitol because she knew them because they were outside her clinic most days. I wonder if you can speak to that connection between January 6th and the people who are outside clinics harassing patients and providers.
That's a really great observation. It shows that the anti-abortion movement is really not just about abortion. It's really about how the radical right is building a reactionary, anti-democratic political movement. Abortion has become a litmus test, like the binary yes or no issue that far-right politicians and leaders and key activists use to distinguish between the us and the them, and the sort of pure and the impure. They know if you can like boil all of the complex questions of life down to a single binary life and death issue, you can control their vote. And they use this issue in particular to divide Americans and to embroil them in the so-called culture wars in order to masquerade their autocratic leanings, their own corruption, their many failures. So it's for this reason that the radical right won't be satisfied with some compromises at the margins. This is, where we're hearing all the time, oh, if we just compromise here and if we compromise there, then, this issue will go away. No, it absolutely won't. It's part of a much larger, part and parcel of this much larger anti-democratic authoritarian movement. And we really saw this reflected, I would say, in Alito's draft opinion, which was leaked, what was it, a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at sort of the way he crafts this opinion and the logic that he uses, it shows that I'm sorry, let me just grab something to drink. It shows that the loss of reproductive rights, sorry about this.
This happened to me the other day in a live.
I'm sorry.
It's totally.
I know. Sorry. I mean, the loss of reproductive rights will not be the last of the assaults on individual rights, because the framework that he used for taking away these rights leaves no protection for most of the rights that the other rights that we also hold dear. In his writing, unless these rights were explicitly acknowledged in amendments that were written down in like 1787 or 1868, when these amendments were written, it isn't a right guaranteed in the Constitution. So we can look at the rights to racial justice, the contraception, LGBT equality, and marriage. Seems like there's a lot of stuff that's up for grabs. So unless you're happy with the rights that existed in that time, you're really out of luck. Now, the only exception, he said, to that reasoning is those rights established by quote unquote history and tradition, which he traces to judges who ordered the execution of witches and common laws that preferenced certain racial and gender hierarchies and also preferenced certain religions. So this is really a radical agenda. The post-Roe world that we're heading toward is really just one step and a slide to autocracy, unfortunately. I think that if the Supreme Court thinks it's going to create a so-called Christian nation, they're sorely mistaken. It's going to create an America that's far less healthy, far less legitimate, far more divided and less governable. But if you look at where the leadership of the movement has been, headed, what they state openly in the forums that they share, and where they're coming from, the sort of breaking democracy isn't a side effect of Christian nationalism. It's really the point of the project. And you see a lot of this crystallized in these activists of January 6th, and the fact that so many of them were on the front lines of the anti-choice movement.
Thank you so much, Katherine. You truly read the signs of the times. I know you embed in a lot of right-wing spaces, and you will go to things like the March for Life, and and I'm grateful to all you do to really shed light on this, and particularly the way in which abortion has been used to animate this much more radical right-wing agenda. So thank you. I'm wondering if we have questions. I can't see them if we do.
While we wait, I just want to say, Katherine, that I was just on a podcast 2 weeks ago and talking about this very thing, and made the case, or helped to people to trace that the issues that we're having right now, because the podcast was geared towards a Black audience, and I was like, the issues that we're having right now with gerrymandering and voter suppression can be directly traced to this anti-choice movement, and how the far right used it as a wedge issue. And so I'm just really grateful for the work that you're doing in the world.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for what you do. And I can't wait to listen to that podcast. You're gonna have to put a link in the chat if you can find it, or share it later, but I'd love to listen.
I wonder if any other panelists want to engage a bit more with each other. I want to give space for that as well, because I meant to, and then I forgot. It's been a long month.
I definitely wanted to while they were talking, like they were saying things, and I'm like, oh yeah, for sure.
Excellent.
So Jamie, this is Russ, and I'm just going to interject here with one of the questions that one of our participants has asked. And it's not directed to anyone in particular. They write, we know that folks generalize the motivation for abortion as a form of birth control. Yet we know that there are many reasons much more specific than a simple generalization. Can any of you speak to that and how we might reply?
I'm happy to start. Sorry, Kenyetta, you can go if you'd like. So I think that there's a lot of practical retorts to that. So first of all, it's not true, right? It's just not. But and it's an argument that's used and a line that's used to make people worry about multiple abortions, or people just flippantly having abortions, which we've discussed, and I think all of us have talked about the thoughtfulness that goes into the decisions to have abortions. And that's not to stigmatize people who do have multiple abortions, because there are people that do, and that's okay if they need multiple abortions. Every abortion is a needed abortion. That being said, looking at what it takes to get an abortion right now in this country, it's very clear that there are not lots of people that are using this as a regular form of birth control. It costs between $500 and $2,000 to access an abortion. It requires, in a lot of places, multiple trips to see a provider. It requires hours in clinic, taking time off of work, getting childcare, all sorts of things. That really is just not practically a useful way to prevent being pregnant. And I think that that's the other thing that I'd like to really reiterate here, is that birth control or contraception is to prevent becoming pregnancy. Abortion is different than that. Abortion is ending a pregnancy that is currently existing. And while that can be a complicated subject for some people, it gets conflated a lot, particularly in politics. We've seen it in a lot of the legislation that is sort of cropping up since we've seen the leaked SCOTUS opinion, where people are saying that IUDs are abortifacient, or the morning after pill is an abortifacient. And so being very, very clear about when a pregnancy begins, which is not at conception or fertilization, it is at implantation. Tons of fertilized eggs just go through your system and never become a pregnancy. That's a natural part of human biology. And so being very clear about when a pregnancy begins and what can end a pregnancy is an important conversation when we're discussing the scientific part of abortion. And so to answer the question about how to respond to that, I would say that the data does not show that people are using abortion as contraception, and that also common sense, given the number of barriers that exist, would also demonstrate that people are not using it in that way.
So Dr. Jen basically said what I was going to say. I think what is not understood by a lot of the country is that though Roe v. Wade has been the law of the land since 1973, people of color, Black women, and poor women have always struggled to access abortion care, even though it was the law of the land, even though we had the right secured. It is cost prohibitive for a lot of people. And even when it's not cost prohibitive, there are things like, depending on your geographical location in the country, travel and childcare, and it would be someone's last choice as contraception. No one would willingly use abortion as contraception. And I also think that what I find kind of hypocritical about even that question is that in many of the states where it's hard to get abortion, they also don't provide comprehensive sex education. And so therefore, saying that you don't want people to use abortion as contraception without teaching them about how to use proper contraception seems like disingenuous at best.
Sorry, Katherine, I just want to say one more thing right there, which is it also is sort of hypocritical and frankly obnoxious in terms of that we need to trust people to make their own decisions. Like either we trust people to know what's right for them or we don't. And we think that other people should make those determinations. And so if somebody is saying like, oh, I don't want them to use that for birth control, the underlying tenet there is that I think I know what's better for them than they do. And I think what most Americans hold pretty dearly is that idea of independence and autonomy, is that I know what's best for me and for my family. And so really kind of leaning into that value, I think is important. Sorry, Katherine,
I'm sorry, Katherine, I'm going to jump back into, but what you said, Jen, really just speaks to the actual, and I'm just going to say it, I'm not familiar with your group, but I'm just going to speak how I normally speak when I speak in groups. And the fact of the matter is the underlying issue to all of this is the paternalism of white supremacy that says white men get to determine how everybody else governs their lives and how everybody else deals with their bodies. And that other people know best what you should do with your body, namely white supremacist patriarchy.
I'd like to add one more thing. I spent a lot of time in the sort of right-wing conferences and gatherings and anti-choice movement events. I went March for Life, National Pro-Life Summit. I tend to go to. You never hear about how deeply restrictions on abortion reach into maternal medicine. I think it's like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. Often people require miscarriage management. Women need miscarriage management in order to, not develop sepsis or to stop bleeding or for life-saving reasons. And I'm in the places where abortion is restricted, miscarriage management is also restricted, and the consequences are awful. I mean, I've spoken to a number of OBGYNs who have had to deal with the consequences of people going through miscarriages, being turned away, or sort of crisis pregnancies being turned away from hospitals that don't offer abortion. Which frankly, there are a lot of restrictions at Catholic hospitals due to the ethical and religious directives, which govern healthcare in Catholic settings. And I remember having a conversation with one doctor who dealt with a young woman who she developed sepsis. She had a high fever. She developed a cognitive injury. She had to be transferred to a long-term care facility. And he said, we would never have waited this long before evacuating the uterus in a non-religious healthcare setting. this is not restricted to Catholic healthcare settings. If in regions where there's a lot of strong anti-abortion sentiment, miscarriage management or difficulty, pregnancy complications, treatment for that is also restricted, and the consequences on women's health are really dire. And I'm really concerned about what's going to happen when, there have been bills introduced where, you're not allowed to teach, abortion in medical schools. What's going to happen when if you come to a hospital and you're hemorrhaging, or you've got an incomplete miscarriage and you're developing sepsis, no one knows how to treat you. I mean, this is a really dangerous situation. I think there are a lot of folks out there who think, well, I'd never have an abortion. This is never going to affect me. 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. So, this is going to affect an awful lot of people that we know.
Thank you so much, all of you. That was very powerful exchange. Russ, do we have another question? I see a hand raised.
Yeah, there are a few questions that have come in, and one of them that strikes me as something that I think a lot of our folks might be interested in hearing your perspectives on is this particular person said that they were, through the age of 50, for their childhood, were taken to the Right to Life rallies in Washington, D.C. And that was just sort of part of their upbringing, their whole experience. And so they're looking for a way to reconcile their love of God, their love for the church, their Catholic identity, and their desire to see a woman have her own right to choose. That's a big question. We spent some time on that last week, but if anyone would like to sort of speak to how people of faith might reconcile those two things, that would be helpful.
I guess I can start here. Though I'm not Catholic, I come from a very strict religious upbringing, and I had to do a similar reconciling for myself when I came to the understanding that I was a queer person. And so I had to figure out how to reconcile my faith with reconcile who I was told that God was and who I understood myself to be. And that was a long journey. But the thing that was at the root of helping me navigate that was that I found in my searching that there was a through line through a lot of the faith religions, the world's religions, that comes down to love. The through line that I found as I explored the world's religions is loving God, loving yourself, and loving your neighbor as yourself. It's the three things that when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he said that this is it. He's like, the greatest is to love God, but the second is as important as the first, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. Rooting myself in that allowed me space to expand. And what I've come to understand is that theology in and of itself is perspective. It is the lens through which the person interprets. And that is subject to human flaws. But the one thing that all of our traditions of love require us to do is to take care of the people that we are actually sharing the planet with, who are living and breathing with us. And so rooting myself in compassionate care for the people in my faith community, creating space for people to show up as their whole selves without me implementing judgment, really, really did help me. Because like we said, like that has been said several times, 1 in 4 women in this country will have an abortion, which means that you not only know someone who has had an abortion, you love someone who's had an abortion. And they may have had to make that decision in the shadows, in secret, without support, out of fear of judgment from the people who they actually should be receiving support and care from. So for me, what really helped me in shifting even my love for myself as I reconciled my faith and my sexual orientation was understanding that if I loved God, loved myself, and tried my very best to love the people that I share the world with, everything else was superfluous.
I'd love to thank you for sharing that, Kenyetta. That was really moving. And, you know, I also used to attend Right to Life rallies, never made it to DC, although we did travel for one of the Supreme Court cases when I was in junior high early in the 2000s. And so that was like a big thing in the front of the Supreme Court. And so I know how many of you who maybe had that experience feel. And I also know how deep Catholic doctrine and teachings and ritual are for those of us who were brought up Catholic or who are devout Catholics, how much it is part of our DNA, whether we want it to be or not. And for me, in a lot of the transitions that I've made, one of the things that has been really helpful is thinking about Jesus and who Jesus was and what he taught, as Kenyetta was talking about. And he wasn't hanging out with the guys who are bishops. He was hanging out with the women who were having abortions and with the people who had to steal to survive, right? He was hanging out with the lepers and the sinners because he was offering his hand to them and taking them with compassion and non-judgment and asking people not to cast stones because nobody is without sin. And so, you know, I think a lot about my mom when folks ask this question because she's deeply, deeply devout. It has a lot of conflict around abortion. But she's given me permission to tell the story about when she was 15, she actually drove her best friend to have, at the time, what was an illegal abortion. And she was really conflicted about it the entire time, was saying, I don't think you should do this. I think this is wrong. I don't think you should do this. But still stood there and held her best friend's hand while she had that abortion. And that's what we need from people, is that ability to say, I don't know how I personally feel about this, but I love you. I love who you are. I respect you. And I'm going to stand there and hold your hand. And that's what she does for me every single day. My mom, this devout Catholic, is she stands up and she holds my hand. She's not totally sure why I do what I do, right? She jokes she wishes I was a plastic surgeon, but beyond that, she loves that I deliver babies and loves that I do all the, that I'm a surgeon and I do these other things. She sometimes is confused about why I provide abortion, but she trusts me and knows me and loves me and stands by me and prays for me and for my patients. And not in a like you're going to hell way, but in a like I want you to have a good and safe day way. And that's the Catholicism that she emulates, that I hope to continue to emulate. And I think that Catholics for Choice and many people who support women and the people who need abortions also emulate. It's not that of the white male hierarchy of the church, but is that of the radical Christ-like Catholicism that we can find in the dogma if we look for it.
Thank you so much. Russ, you said we might have a few more questions?
Yeah, so there are a couple here. Some of them are, I think, a little bit rapid fire medical questions, perhaps to Jen. One question that was asked is, what do you think about these laws that use implantation as the point at which we can create some policies or guidelines around abortion? Is that even something that we can know?
No, There's no way to know when implantation happens, and there's definitely no way to know when fertilization happens. It's just scientifically, like even if you were undergoing ultrasound 24 hours a day, it would not be possible. The way that we know that you're pregnant, and so I'll get a little bit sciencey here, is that at the moment that at the moment of implantation, there's certain cells, syncytial trophoblasts, that start to secrete beta HCG, which is the pregnancy hormone. It has to reach a level which is detectable. And so that pregnancy has to be implanted, and those cells need to be replicating for a period of time before you're able to either have a blood test or a urine pregnancy test to detect pregnancy. And that's really the only way that you can detect implantation. And so this is a great demonstration of politicians who know nothing about medicine or biology making laws that make zero sense. And to Katherine's point earlier, it's really dangerous. We can laugh at some of these sillier ones where, politicians are saying we should reimplant ectopic pregnancies into the uterus and things like that are completely wild. But the problem is that as a physician, I have to read these laws and I have to try to abide by them. And they make no sense. It's like you're taking a cruise ship manual and trying to drive a car. That's not even a great analogy because they're both vehicles. I mean, it doesn't even line up at all. And they're incredibly confusing. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what it does is, as myself as a doctor, it's making me think about my safety, about my license, about my livelihood, about my career, my possible criminal prosecution, before I'm thinking about you or your family member and what it is that they need for their care. And that's a really scary prospect, not only for me as a physician, but it should be a really prospect for every single person who's seeking healthcare, period. Because it means that there is something that is in between me, the science, and you. And that's the politicians who don't know what they're talking about.
Absolutely. We're already getting stories from Texas where their ban is in place and operating, where people are being turned away mid miscarriage because the hospital is scared to get in trouble, basically.
Thanks, everyone. We're coming up here on just the last few minutes of the time that we have scheduled. And I see Mary Ellen McCarthy, you do have your hand raised. I've tried to reach out to you in the chat to see what your question is. But I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute and see if you'd like to ask your question on microphone.
Can you hear me at this point?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm concerned because I think we need much more education and publication of the indications that may result in the need for an abortion due to the health of the mother and the conditions. The decision of the Catholic Church to the bishop that excommunicated Sister McBride because she saved the life of the mother is just absolutely appalling. And Sister Diana Ortiz's book on Through the Blindfold's Eyes is one of the most powerful that I've ever read on the mental health effects of rape and torture. But there's not much discussion about that. And my question is there more that can be done in that area? Because I think that reaches some people that other arguments don't reach.
So Mary Ellen, just to clarify, your question is about studying the mental health effects?
Well, my question is about alerting the public to the kinds of bad things that can happen to people that require an abortion. And that, these are real things and they impact people's lives. And to say that, we must let a mother die along with a non-viable child, to me, it seems like, it just seems crazy. It just seems crazy. But I don't think enough people know about the kinds of complications that can arise in both either mental and physical health, and how important it is for that to be a decision between the patient and the doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Ellen. I know, Diana, you're working very hard to publish the mental health effects of being denied care. I don't know if you
Yeah,
want to.
so what the Turnaway Study shows is that quite opposite to what has been asserted. In fact, the group with the worst mental health is those who are denied abortions, not those who receive it. And we actually see higher anxiety, lower self-esteem, lower life satisfaction among the people denied abortions compared to those who receive it. And that effect is pretty short run. Over time, those two groups actually look similar. But note that this study, it didn't include people who specifically are seeking abortion for mental health reasons, or who's had, so there may be people for whom that difference is even greater. And I think that part of the story is that people are resilient in their attitudes, they're resilient in their emotions, but there are some places people just cannot muster resilience, and that's in, creating food to feed children. It's in, being able to work or take care of themselves, achieve other life goals. So you can get, there's more resilience, I think, on the mental health front. We see some people who experience severe mental health problems, and what predicts that is childhood abuse and childhood neglect. There are things that have huge effects on people's mental well-being, but unwanted pregnancy isn't very high among them for most people. And that people are resilient, and there are ways in which that, two women who died from childbirth, that's not a question of resilience. You can't expect someone to get over this. People's lives are affected very broadly.
Thank you, Diana. Anyone else?
I think that I appreciate Mary Ellen's assertion that more public knowledge should be made around these things. But I also want to offer that the abortions that that people are wanting to be less prominent, and people needing less access to, a lot of that would be solved with actually caring about children, like children who are actually here and living and breathing. There is so little support for mothers and people who are parenting. And as Diane mentioned earlier, people are making decisions around abortion based on their social and economic status. And so we cannot allow for a government that says that they are restricting people's control over their bodies in the name of children, while also not advocating for actual things for children who are actually here living and breathing.
Not only children, but I know we have 1 minute left, but also the parents. I have had multiple patients, Black women, tell me that they're having an abortion because they're scared of dying in delivery, because the mortality rate in the US for Black women is 3 times that of white women. And they say, I have 3 kids at home. I'd love to have a 4th. I'd love to continue this pregnancy, but I can't die and leave my kids alone. And so I have to make this really hard choice to have this abortion because I'm scared of what pregnancy would do to my family.
Absolutely.
So people are making decisions based on the fact that we're not taking care of them in the rest of their lives. And I think that that's a really critical piece for us to consider as a country. And, going back to opening that Jamie mentioned about what's going on in the US right now, and Kenyetta's connection to reproductive justice, this all comes back to reproductive justice and supporting families and supporting people in their lives in all the ways that justice needs to be supported.
Absolutely.
Yeah, how can we say anything other than amen to that closure? I would just like to thank Jamie, Kenyetta, Katherine, Diana, Jen for a very informative and very moving presentation, and that I think touches our minds, our hearts, our soul, and gives us a lot to think about. moving forward into these increasingly critical times. Thank you to Russ for managing our technology and the questions and answers, and especially to everyone who took the time and mustered the energy to be here tonight, to be part of this session. Just a reminder that we will be sending a recording of this session and last week's session to everybody who registered, and ask that you be thoughtful about how you share the information and get it to people that you think it will be helpful to. Again, if you're interested in learning more about CORE, our member organizations, and the work that we will continue to do, please visit our website, which I've posted in the chat. Again, on behalf of all of the members of the core groups, we thank everybody who had a role in organizing this session, all who presented, and to everyone who's being there. We hope you found this evening very helpful, and have a good night.